Hey everybody, it's Alexander Williamson here with The Secret History Living in Your Aquarium. Today we're going to talk about the most frequent question that I receive. And that is my snail dead? Is it alive? Or is it sick? And we're going to answer how we can figure that out with a couple neat little tricks. And then also, if your snail is alive but it's not doing so well, what we can do about that and how we can fix the situation and make sure that your snail is healthy and happy. So we're going to talk about mystery snails, nerite snails, Ramshorn snails, devil spike snails or cappuccino snails as they're also known, and also, some bladder snails, pond snails. We'll talk about a lot of different snails. We'll see a lot of snails. So let's jump right in right now and get right to it and start talking about what it is that you can spot in a snail that is a change in behavior, a change in look, or even smell that will let you know how it's doing. Alright guys, so we're talking about snails, and first we're going to talk about some of the most common snails, which would be nerite snails. Now this is a horned nerite. It's a small little one, and we can see that its foot is up against the glass. So you can see that foot there, its mouth or foot, is against the glass. Now usually it has a little mouth that works and scrapes the glass like little teeny ice scrapers would work on your car. There's usually two of them. So what's the issue if it's not moving? What's going on? If it's not moving its mouth but it's still holding on to the glass, well, the first big thing you can take a sigh of relief about is that it is alive. It is holding on. If it's held on to some funky position, it is alive. So if it's on a plant or on, a corner of the aquarium or something, if it's up out of the water especially, sometimes they'll even climb all up into, your filter. They'll get all up in there. And that is a sign that it's able to hold on and that it's probably alive. Most of the time. Now there are a few exceptions where it can dry very quickly and it's not. But how are we going to tell if this thing is alive? So this goes for all snails, from nerite snails, apple snails, ram snails, mystery snails, pond snails, bladder snails, you name it. Put some food in their tank. It seems pretty obvious, right guys? But put some food in their tank. Before you yank on them or anything, just put a couple pieces of food in their tank. Now, the exception to this is if they've crawled out of the water like they have on this tank up here, and in that case, what you're going to do is you're just gently going to see if touching them, if nudging them, if they release, and if they're firm where their mouth is, you can pull hard enough that they'll come off. They're not going to come out of their shell or anything, but you can turn them over and then you can very easily check if they're alive. So some snails, like Ramshorn snails, don't really close up. They have a wet foot that is going to move and change shape like this one, and we'll put it back in the water. It'll be okay out of the water for a while, but we'll put it in the water, and then if we were curious how it was doing, we could also put food next to it, which we'll get back to in a moment. But some other snails, and you see right now we can tell that it's actually moving along that leaf. So it just literally crawled up and out of the aquarium to eat some of this algae that was hanging out on the side of the filter. But if it was outside of the aquarium, feel free to grab it. If there's any resistance, your snail is alive. So the other thing that you'll know if it's out of the aquarium is if it's stinking. If it's on the floor or something, maybe it got out and then fell straight down onto the floor. It's not going to smell good. But there's a little more to that than just not smelling good out of the water. And let me tell you a cool little trick to figure that part out. Alright, so let's say that the snail wasn't underwater, or was underwater and not above water and on the ground. So you can check if it's alive. Well, obviously, if it moves at all, it's alive. But you can, and now the other one moved. But let's pretend like it didn't, and we were curious if these Malaysian trumpet snails were alive. Because these are awesome snails, but they're nocturnal. So a lot of times if they get out of the substrate, where they generally sleep, and I fed these and it's nighttime outside, so they feel safe enough and their biological clock is telling them, oh, wake up, it's time to eat. So they're out and they're eating. But If it were the middle of the day, sometimes they just play dead if they are out and about and they were not feeling well, or maybe they were just crossing in between an open area or a big rock or something. And the easiest way to tell, after you put some food in, and if they're not moving after 5 or 10 minutes, you're watching them, then what you can do is you can take a very simple instrument that everybody should have in their fish room because it's super handy for a million things, the turkey baster. So then you can put the turkey baster in, and literally you're not gonna bug the snail too much, but you can puff a couple just slight, like half or a third squeeze of the bulb around it, and then you can kind of see if it'll let go. If it doesn't let go, then it's clearly alive. If it does let go and you're able to turn it, then use your turkey baster or your hand. Make sure your hands are very clean, obviously, before and after. Don't use soap necessarily, but maybe a rubbing alcohol and then lots of water, just rubbing your hands afterwards, after the alcohol evaporates off. But here we can see that this snail has closed its operculum, and that is that little trap door which snails close and open to keep hydrated. So if this snail had gotten out of the water, it would have closed that up if it fell out of the tank or something, but not all species have that. So look up if your snail has an operculum, and if it's a species that does, it is alive. If its operculum is closed, it's almost certainly alive if it's not smelling terrible. Now, sometimes they do die with their operculum closed. In fact, they usually do, but within a day or two, it generally shrivels their body, and then it kind of collapses inward. So you'll see that there's a partial opening. Now, what we're going to do with the turkey baster is we're literally just going to puff around the snail, and then we're going to take in water from surrounding the snail's opening and where it was. And then you're literally right over your aquarium just going to smell how it smells. And if it has been dead and it's rotting, you will smell it. It smells like warm shrimp on the beach that's been dead for days. It smells like, you know, a beach, a salty ocean beach, if you've smelled that smell on a hot day. And it's not a good smell. And if that's not coming from your snail, then it's probably coming from your aquarium somewhere else, and you need to treat it regardless. It's something going on with your tank not being balanced. Now, when we look here, this is a black devil spike snail. And we can see that he's doing just fine just because he's sticking out of his shell and he's got his foot hanging on. But what do we do if they're up towards the top again and we don't know if they're doing okay? Well, I want to show you guys Ramshorn snails. And again, here's another black devil spike snail, sometimes called the cappuccino snail. And these guys are all freshwater. All the snails we're looking at are freshwater. And these guys can get pretty good size, 2 or 3 inches easily. You'll usually see their foot holding on outside of the water, and they won't stay out too long. Now, if we're looking at Ramshorn snails, these curlicue guys, the spirals, they're a little different. And there are a few ways to tell how they're doing. And one of the really cool things about these snails is they can tell you how your entire aquarium is doing, which is very helpful for shrimp and sensitive fish like rainbow fish, or black water fish like licorice gouramis or something like that. Bettas even. If you've got wild bettas, I always keep snails with them. One, the bettas like to nibble sometimes on the little wild snails. These are wild bettas right here. And 2, they clean up waste in the tank, and they just make a good partner that has armor that can defend itself. And that goes the same for the domestic bettas. They're also great with them. But if you have your snails floating at the top of the water, they're alive. Ah, what a relief, right guys? So snails also use oxygen, and they need it in their blood to survive. So if you can't see their foot out and they're moving around and doing their thing, going up or down or crawling around or eating, they may have pulled inside. Now, depending on the species of snail, they may or may not have that operculum, which is that trap door or that manhole cover, that lid covering to their shell opening. But if that opening seems hollow, seems empty, and your snail is floating like some of these are up here, but you don't see their foot out eating, they're alive because that oxygen that they need to breathe, they use that just like a submarine would, and they can sink by letting some out, and they can also rise if they have eaten sand or if they have waste in them and they're waiting to go to the bathroom. They can rise by releasing it. Now, one of the other most important things when we're talking about is your snail alive or dead, is knowing what your snails do day in and day out. And I know it's not the prettiest thing, but making castings, as we like to call them to be polite, or poop, making poop. The snails make poop, there I said it. They make these little curly Q poops, and if you're watching your snail and you're trying to see how they're doing, but they're not moving enough for you to tell, some snails will have clear enough shells that you can actually see their inner workings, just specialty varieties and things, but all snails will have curly Qs right under them where they've been using the bathroom. So if they've been eating, that's how you can tell, best of all, other than the food being gone, that your snails are eating and that they're happy. Now, why might they not be happy, or what might they be eating other than the food you give them? Let's take a look at another snail right now. Alright, so here we have my old battle-hardened mystery snail, and this guy is one of my favorite snails. He has fallen out of the tank, cracked, he's been through it all, he's been chomped on by big cichlids, and yet he has held his ground and stayed in this tank. We can see that he is eating. We can see his little mouth parts. Like, we couldn't see that nerite in the beginning, and nerite snails have this exact same mouth setup with the little teeth like this that scrape. And so what we can do then, if we don't see poop, or if there's too much flow in the tank to see where the poop went, or maybe there's too much other mold and stuff in the tank, we can look for their trails. So on land, snails and slugs leave sticky, slimy trails. Underwater, if you have algae anywhere in your tank, or moss sometimes, like light-colored moss, you can see where they've been grazing. And so you can look for these, and if it's a nerite snail, they have a specific pattern even. They have a zigzag, what we call a zipper trail. And if it is a mystery snail, it'll have more of a, I mean, it could go in loop-de-loos for all we know, but it has more of a straight. So the edges of the trail on the algae, it's a straight line cutting through that. So we can see that there with the contrast. And it's definitely not those little snails making that. But how can we tell how our snails are doing if maybe they're not, you know, the healthiest? I mean, the other thing that will happen is over time, your snails will lose their color. So if they're a uniform white color, or if they were colorful and the color's gone, that is a pretty surefire way to know that they have passed away, unfortunately. But let's look at the last trick I want to show you, which is how we can use our snails to make sure that our shrimp are healthy and our fish are healthy and that our tank is balanced. So, in all these tanks I have shrimp, and it's important to know the GH and KH, the general hardness and the carbonate hardness. Now, it's also important to know that the nitrates and the ammonia are not extremely high. None of these snails will survive in high ammonia. Some will survive in higher ammonia than fish, but high ammonia will kill snails just like it does fish. And so that is a sign. If your snails are dying, something is very wrong. If all your snails are dying, something is very, very wrong. But what we can do is we can look at these same snails, especially Ramshorn snails or snails that form with a cone or a spiral in any shape. And we can look at that and we can actually, like rings on a tree, you can tell a lot about how the snail grew. So, see these grooves that are all right together? It grew in a very even pattern there, but it had extra calcium. You see those stripes, those zebra stripes? That's from extra calcium when it was forming. And right here we've got another little bump forming, and the snail cells actually grow from the mouth of the shell out and around, not from the center part. And so the other thing that sometimes you can see is that the center of the snail shell will look hollow or will have pieces missing. And these are starting to get that way. And that means that even if there is some extra calcium there, it's formed incorrectly because their body wasn't able to form it properly as a very young snail. And now they're trying to reinforce it by putting more layers of calcium on to strengthen that weak area in the center. So even though it may look like you don't see through the snail, and I must say that these are an albino form of Ramshorn snail. So this, as well as there's one right down here, these are about as translucent as your snails will ever get, right here. If they are more translucent than this, I mean, and this one, we can even see the air bubble from when they surf and act like a submarine and go up and down. We can see some of the air bubbles. If that was full of air and it was going to do that trick where it rises to the surface, it would have created a whole pocket of air. But there we can see its stomach and actually part of it, its nervous system and all the musculature too. Well, if it weren't an even color and an even clarity, that would tell us that the calcium's either too little or too much. And same with the carbon. So you need to check your TDS, or your total dissolved solids, and find out what's going on. So there's tests you can buy, like the API test kits for all the other things, that are a little color reactive test that you put in a vial, and it will help you out and let you know what exactly was off in your tank. So these are some of the tips and tricks of how I can tell if a snail is alive. I mean, we talked about you pull on it, see if it's stuck to something. If it is, it's almost certainly alive. If it's discolored and all one color that's not the same color it used to be, it's probably dead. If it's out on the floor and it has an open shell and or it smells bad, it is probably dead. But if it has an open shell and it doesn't smell bad, put it in the water, see if it comes, if its foot and head come back out. And if they don't, when you put some food out for it, I mean, it should very quickly try to go and find cover. So they don't like being out if they don't have that operculum cover. Now, if they're a kind that is able to close that, you'll usually know they're okay because that little manhole cover flap is closed. And so that's how you'll know they're okay. Now, if they're floating at the top and they're surfing, they may have that flap closed too, and they may not be interested in food. There's lots of reasons why snails act differently. Here's some bladder snails too for just a sense of it. Pond snails and bladder snails are very similar, and they hang out at the top a lot. Usually these are more of a pest snail, so I'm not going to get into them in this video. But I do have videos on all of these snails on their own on my channel elsewhere if you're interested. So I hope this info helped you guys out a little bit, and maybe some of these tips or tricks are able to save some of your other critters. But this is Alex Williamson with The Secret History Living in Your Aquarium, and that was talking about if your snail is alive or dead and how to find out. Talk to you guys later. Please hit that like button if you like this, and subscribe if you want to know more about all the critters in your aquarium, the history of where they come from, the history of how they evolved, and all sorts of cool facts, trivia, and information about all things aquarium, from plants to fish to the technology. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.